Imagining a world where the powerful rule with an iron fist and the poor live in constant fear is not too far from the truth of the 14th century. This was a time when kings and princes could be both heroes and villains, where wars were fought not just for land but for glory, and where the lives of ordinary people were often seen as expendable. One such story from this era involves the Pope, a powerful king, and a group of desperate soldiers. It's a tale of greed, honor, and the unexpected twists that can change the course of history. In 1367, the Pope Urban V found himself in a difficult situation. His city, Avignon, was under threat from a group of mercenaries led by Bertrand du Guesclin, a famous and feared warrior. These mercenaries, known as the Free Companies, had been hired by the King of France to fight in Spain. However, after their victory, they returned to France and began causing chaos, looting and pillaging towns and villages along the way. The Pope, desperate to protect his city, was forced to make a difficult decision. "They shall have it," said the Pope without hesitation, provided that they then leave the country. The Pope was referring to the demand made by du Guesclin's men for a large sum of money, 200,000 francs. From his window, Urban could see the men at arms seizing livestock, chickens and geese, and even the good white bread that was meant for the people of Avignon. The Pope knew he had to act quickly to prevent further destruction. To raise the money, the Pope called a council of advisors. They suggested a tax on the bourgeois of Avignon, the wealthy middle class, to avoid depleting the treasures of the church. The money was collected, and the Provost of Avignon, a high-ranking church official, brought it to du Guesclin along with absolutions signed and sealed by the Pope. However, du Guesclin was not satisfied. When he learned that the money had come from the commons of Avignon, he denounced the avarice of the church and refused to accept it. He demanded that the money come from the clergy instead. The Pope, realizing the gravity of the situation, agreed to pay the 200,000 francs from the papal treasury, which he quickly replenished by imposing a tithe on the clergy of France. This incident highlights the complex relationship between the church and the people during the 14th century. The church, which was supposed to be a source of comfort and moral guidance, often found itself entangled in the politics and economics of the time. The Pope's decision to tax the clergy rather than the people shows a certain level of concern for the welfare of the common folk, but it also reveals the church's willingness to exploit its own members to achieve its goals. On the other side of the Channel, in England, the Black Prince, son of King Edward III, was ruling over Aquitaine, a region in southern France. The Black Prince's rule, however, was far from the idyllic picture painted by Chandos Herald, a chronicler of the time. Chandos described the prince's reign as 7 years of joy, peace, and pleasantness, but the reality was quite different. The prince's arrogance and extravagant lifestyle were causing resentment among his Gascon subjects. He was known for his lavish banquets, where he fed over 400 people every day, and his wife, Joan, was famous for her sumptuous fabrics, furs, and jewels. The Black Prince's rule was marked by a lack of financial discipline, and he often imposed harsh taxes on the people to fund his extravagant lifestyle. The Black Prince's reign in Aquitaine was not just a personal failure, but also a strategic one. His actions were alienating the loyalty and allegiance of the people he was supposed to protect. The situation came to a head when Don Pedro, the King of Castile, appealed to the Black Prince for help in his struggle against his half-brother, Don Enrique. Don Pedro promised to repay all the costs of the war, but the Black Prince, despite being advised against it, decided to take up his cause. The prince was motivated by a desire for war and glory, as well as the need to break a Franco-Castilian alliance that threatened English communication with Aquitaine. The Battle of Nájera in April 1367 was a turning point in the conflict. The English, led by the Black Prince, won a famous victory against the French forces, who were supporting Don Enrique. However, the victory was short-lived. Don Pedro, true to his character, defaulted on his debts, leaving the Black Prince and his troops unpaid. The prince, hard pressed by his angry soldiers, encouraged them to return to France and supply themselves by force. These Anglo-Gascon bands, small in number but war-hardened, caused great damage and tribulation in the regions of Champagne and Picardy. The Black Prince's actions had far-reaching consequences. His pride and arrogance further alienated the Gascons. and when he transferred the burden of Don Pedro's debts to the people of Guyenne through annual hearth taxes, the Gascon lords rebelled. They reopened negotiations with Charles V, the King of France, for a return to French allegiance. This move effectively nullified the Treaty of Bretigny, which had been signed in 1360 to end the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The situation in France at this time was dire. The country had been ravaged by war, plague, and internal strife. One of the most significant challenges was the shortage of labor, particularly in regions like Picardy, which had been hit hard by the Black Death. Landowners, including Inguer, and the 7th Lord of Coucy, were struggling to keep their serfs, or non-free peasants, on the land. Coucy's solution was to enfranchise the serfs in his domain, a move that was both practical and forward-thinking. In August 1368, Coucy issued a charter granting freedom to the serfs of 22 towns and villages in his barony. The charter acknowledged that many serfs had left the land to live outside his jurisdiction, causing the land to become uncultivated and less valuable. In exchange for specific rents and revenues from each village, Coucy granted the serfs their freedom, allowing them to live and work on the land without the constraints of serfdom. This move was not motivated by a moral judgment of the evils of servitude, but rather by a practical need to keep the land productive and to raise revenue. The Charter of Enfranchisement was a significant step in the dissolution of serfdom, a process that had been ongoing in France since the 11th century. By the 14th century, free peasants were already in the majority, and the abolition of serfdom was more about economic necessity than moral righteousness. Landowners like Coucy recognized that the paid labor of free tenants, though more expensive, was more reliable and productive than the unpaid labor of serfs. The cost of feeding serfs on the job, combined with the difficulty of retaining them, made the transition to a free labor system increasingly attractive. Coucy's decision to enfranchise his serfs was also influenced by the broader economic and social changes of the time. The Black Death, which had swept through Europe in the 1340s, had decimated the population, leading to a labor shortage. This shortage gave peasants more leverage to demand better living conditions and greater freedoms. Coucy's charter was a response to these changes, aimed at stabilizing his domain and ensuring the continued productivity of the land. Despite the challenges of the time, life for the nobility and the wealthy was still marked by luxury and grandeur. The center of attraction in Paris was the king's new residence, the Palace of St. Paul, a magnificent complex with 7 gardens, a cherry orchard, and a menagerie. The palace was a symbol of the king's power and wealth, and it attracted the elite of French society. Nobles and high-ranking officials built grand hotels in the city, acquiring urban interests and participating in the cultural and social life of the capital. The nobility of the 14th century enjoyed a life of leisure and entertainment, with hunting and hawking being popular pastimes. Falcons and other birds of prey were carried on the wrist, even indoors, and were used in elaborate feasts where live birds were released from pastries to be caught by hawks in the banquet hall. The nobility also engaged in various forms of entertainment, including music, dancing, and verbal games. These activities were a way to pass the time, and to display one's wealth and status. The 14th century was a time of contrast, where the beauty and grandeur of the nobility's life stood in stark contrast to the suffering and hardship of the common people. While the nobles enjoyed their luxury, the peasants and the poor struggled to survive. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the internal strife within France had left the country in a state of turmoil. However, even in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of beauty and joy. Festivals such as the Swan Chase in Picardy brought people together, and the emphasis on courteous conduct and etiquette reflected the social norms of the time. In the end, the 14th century was a time of great change and transformation. The enfranchisement of serfs, the rise of the middle class, and the changing role of the nobility all contributed to the shaping of modern Europe. The stories of the Pope, the Black Prince, and Lord Coucy serve as a reminder of the complex and often contradictory nature of medieval society. While the powerful could be both generous and cruel, the common people, though often overlooked, were the true foundation of the world they inhabited. The 14th century was a time of both darkness and light, and it is through the stories of its people that we can better understand the world that shaped our own.